Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria University, please visit avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I'm joined by Dr. and Professor Thomas Harmon, who is the Scanlon Foundation Professor of Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and the founding director of a new MA in Evangelization and Culture in coordination with the Word on Fire Institute. So welcome to the show, Tom.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here.
Right. Dr. Harmon is also a double alumnus of Ave Maria. You did your master's and your PhD here, graduating back with your PhD in 2012. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so we're certainly very proud of all you've done, and it's delightful to have you here, not only as a former student, but as a fellow teacher and professor, and really just a wonderful communicator of the Catholic faith.
It's great to be back home.
Oh. Absolutely, so welcome. And I should mention in part, by the way, even to some of our listeners and viewers, that we found out recently that we've had over 50,000 listens, I think as of January or so. So just wanted to thank everyone who takes the time to listen and watch the Catholic Theology Show and to share us with your family members and friends. So we are very grateful and humbled by the attention and the willingness to just continue to try to deepen our own minds and hearts by immersing them in the great Catholic theological and intellectual tradition. And I think, Professor Harmon's work is just a wonderful way of showing that when the more deeply we go into the Bible, into Augustine, into Aquinas, right, the more clearly we can see our own culture. We can when you're in the picture, you can't see the picture. When you're in our culture, you can't see the culture. And the irony is that Augustine was able to see what was going on in Rome in a way that the Romans couldn't see. So your work that you're working on now that I want to talk about today, right, the book you're going to be working on, you've titled provocatively as a demonology of the internet.
That's right, yeah.
So where'd you come up with that title?
It's an odd genesis. I noticed a while ago that there seem to be certain features in common with the way that we are manipulated by online entities. And the ways that the fathers of the church, especially Augustine, described demonic manipulation. And so I thought, let's take a look at this a little bit more closely, both because it's interesting in itself and also maybe to provide a little bit of, some resources to try to defend ourselves right now, both from supernatural and even natural manipulations.
So let's just say somebody's listening to this, and are you suggesting then that the internet is demonic?
No, not quite. No. Okay. I do think that the internet is a tool. And the thing about tools is that anybody can grab the handle. So we use it, but the demons can use it as well. And I think this is true about any technology that we have, is that it can be used for good, it can be used for evil, it can be used by good people, it could be used by bad people. And I'm including in people also angelic or demonic persons. And I think this is not different from other types of media technology that we've had. So if there's a demonology of the internet, there was also a demonology of the television and the radio and the printing press, and you can go back. So.
No, that's a great way of helping us to see the situation. As I'm teaching a course this semester on love, friendship, and the future of being human, and we're diving into this question about what is shifting in our current situation of this massive change in social technology, and yet, on the other hand, also recognizing that these are issues that have been percolating in modernity and in the Enlightenment, and also issues that are just common to being human. So we see Plato and Aristotle talking about them, as well as Jesus and Paul. So, right, this is trying to see that there is something we need to be aware of in our particular age, but at the same time, that these are also perennial problems with being human. I sometimes tell my students the trick is to we do need to raise an alarm, but without becoming alarmist.
That's right. So you mentioned Plato, for instance. In the Phaedrus, Plato warns about this insidious new technology called writing.
Yes,
of course. But so writing has a danger to it. We do it all the time, of course. But Plato in the Phaedrus talks about how writing has the risk of externalizing our memory. Which is, I think, true. Actually, it does do that. Now, the interesting thing about externalizing your memory like that is that, it creates a kind of deficiency in you, but it also allows for a new type of reflection. If your memory has been externalized on the page, then you can begin to think more linearly, more logically, et cetera. And I think maybe this new development of writing is what actually leads to the discovery of philosophy. So there are dangers, but there are also prospects as well. And I think the same is true of any kind of communications technology.
Yeah. Now, there's a documentary called The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which interestingly, somewhat humorously, depicts all the dangers of social media and the social media companies, but not the dangers of, Netflix, right? What's the addictive character of the autoplay? In 5 seconds, your next episode will begin. But they do in there. One of the former executives for Facebook, I think his name's like Tristan Harris or something. He suggests though that the internet may be a tool, perhaps, but that social media is not a tool, because he says he uses the example, right? A tool is like a hammer. It's in my garage, and when I want it, I go get it. It doesn't come like knocking on it doesn't come into my room and give me notifications.
Right.
There was a study that was done by the University of Michigan. I think it was like a year or two ago, maybe in 2023. And it was basically about social media and teens. But it says like the average teen gets 250 or 247, I believe, individual notifications per day.
Yeah.
That's not, that's, and they tend to be on their phone 8 to 10 times a day. So what is then it about then? There's something seemingly about a lot of these social media environments and different things that is somehow more than a tool. What would you say? Yeah,
so I think maybe the way I put it is that maybe there's more to using a tool than we normally consider, and especially a tool like communications tools, which interface with our internal life as well. So one of the people that I've turned to try to figure out what's going on the most is Marshall McLuhan, who was kind of a mid-century media theorist. He's the founder of the field of study called media ecology, and not too many people know this, but he was also a very serious Catholic and a Thomist. And so what he and especially his son Eric started focusing on at the end of their lives is the ways in which the communications technologies act as sort of formal causes for our perceptions, especially having to do with the internal senses. And so what happens then is these communications technologies, as we use them, they begin to sort of shape us. So the famous phrase from John Colkin summarizing McLuhan's theory is that we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us. It's just that with communications technology, they're shaping us in our internal senses sometimes and even in our external senses. So that's the difference with a hammer. A hammer doesn't change the ratio of your senses, or at least not as dramatically as something like social media. That's the beginning to the answer to the question.
That's a great observation. In Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, he gives the example of two other intellectual technologies that have been around for centuries, such as the clock and the map.
Yeah. Changes
our interaction with time and space because we come up with a different way of communicating with the world that in a certain sense allows us to master space and time, or have the illusion that we're mastering space and time while still, of course, being, really, we're actually still subject to so much outside of our control. And in a strange way, it seems to me there's aspects of social media that give us the illusion of being closer to other people, right? I can look on my phone and I know what my cousin is doing, even if I haven't spoken to my cousin in a decade.
Yeah.
Right. And so it gives you this kind of illusion of some kind of like mastery of connection, while often, though, a genuine connection isn't happening. What would you say about that kind of that kind of phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. So again, to go back to McLuhan thinks that the electric communications technology, like from the mid-century, mostly radio and television, especially television, has this strange effect on us that it allows us to think that we don't have bodies anymore. He says that it deludes us into thinking that we're discarnate. And we're not, but we begin to think of ourselves that way. Okay, so social media, I think, is television made more powerful by its insertion into a digital technology. And so what oftentimes this happens is that prior communications technologies get utilized by the next one and actually enhanced or made more powerful by its utilization by the next technology. So what digital technology does is it actually enhances the effects, at least for a while, of televisual technology. So what that means is that social media really makes us feel discarnate, or think of ourselves as discarnate. And so we begin to think of our interpersonal connections in this very disembodied way. And it sort of exaggerates that effect almost to a painful degree, I think. And so I do also want to say that oftentimes what happens here, and this is where there's some hope, I think, is that in exaggerating those effects, it almost becomes absurd. And it's easier to feel the effects. And since the dominant media paradigm has changed, you can actually begin to start thinking about those effects in a little bit. So McLuhan says that normally, with respect to our media environment, we're like fish in water. So we've got no idea that we're in water if we're fish. We've got no idea that we're denizens of a digital environment if we are. And so by utilizing that televisual technology digitally, we begin to think about the effects of television. And that includes like, well, what are we doing? We're projecting an image. And so all of us become celebrities, right? And we begin to think of ourselves more and more in terms of that image. And it becomes more and more important for us to cultivate that image carefully. And so I think actually a lot of conclusions can be drawn from that in terms of a lot of the problems that we have right now. The actually shyness in person is because we live so much in the world of that carefully curated image that you can't curate your embodied image to that degree. And so it makes embodied interactions that much more difficult because you're not used to just dealing with your various imperfections and foibles that way.
Yeah, there's an author, Sherry Turkle, who's written a lot on these themes. She has a book called Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. Mm-hmm. In there, she says one thing, right, is that basically it's like technology becomes kind of seductive when it preys upon our social vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. And so what we have is not that human beings have become different in this mm-hmm. mode. We've always been we've had a lot of social vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Right? It's always been very difficult to be human, to learn how to live in society. But the difference is that the technology kind of preys upon that. And it's interesting the way you were describing that. One of the examples she gives is that she's an anthropologist who then does kind of like an cultural anthropology of the contemporary situation and our interaction with computers. And one of the things she kind of says that in the short version is that we project humanity onto computers and robots.
Yeah.
And then we treat humans as if they were robots and computers.
Yeah.
Right? It's this, and it's even interesting in a lot of movies, and mm-hmm. I know you've done a lot of writing on culture and film, mm-hmm. and those sorts of things. In almost every movie, it's the non-humans' fundamental longing and desire is to become human.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's like Terminator or Barbie, right? It's like there's a desire to become fully human. Mm-hmm. But human beings have this strong desire to escape being human.
Yeah.
Right. So is that a little bit of what when you talk about this disincarnate character, that we somehow become less comfortable in our bodies and in embodied life and embodied interactions? Because an example she gives is, she says a lot of people would, especially, teens and younger people, would be very embarrassed or feel awkward calling people, but they want to text because that way they can control what they're saying and what they're hearing. Whereas opposed to a live conversation, anything can happen. Yeah,
that's right. So, and one of the features of digital technology is it's scripted. So it's programmed, it's pre-programmed, as a matter of fact. And some of the more advanced, sophisticated versions of that, like the large language models like ChatGPT, it's kind of a black box, so we can't really predict what comes out. But basically what you get with computers is you get out of it what you put into it. And that's attractive to us in this new paradigm. But again, this is not new either. So you think of under the influence of mechanical printing press communications technologies, we begin to think of ourselves as machines, and read medical texts in the Enlightenment, and it's all mechanical, but now you read about human thinking, and it's all computer metaphors. Like we talk about memory in terms of both the solid state storage stuff and RAM, and we talk about uploading our consciousness as if it's a program or something like that. So we use all of the same kinds of images drawn from our current technology. So there's an analogy in each case, and so you actually I think see in certain movements in not only pop culture, but the way that we just live our ordinary lives, that we've already started to want ourselves to be more like computers. So there was something that happened, maybe 15 years ago that I think went mostly unremarked, which is that cashiers and customer service people were starting to be given scripts by the home office. And why? Well, they didn't really trust the human beings to interact in a human way. They wanted something scripted. It makes a certain amount of business sense, but it also depersonalizes because it removes that individual person's genius from the interaction. But you also see then, I think one of the main fantasies of our time is this desire on the part of the transhumanists for the singularity, whereby man and machine merge and we can upload our consciousness to the cloud and become immortal, right? But by thinking of ourselves in a reductive way, we sort of miss the fullness of what it means to be human. And so we do, in every age, I think, under the auspices of every media technology, we've got a temptation to reduce ourselves to something less than human. And I think that's how it's going to play out in the digital age, is that we're going to have to figure out who's in charge. Is it the algorithms or us?
Yeah, that's right. And one of the key things to remember always is the algorithms were written by somebody else,
but we forget that.
And
right?
they're just it's just another human being manipulating.
That's right. Yeah.
Me. The script is just another human being writing something. So now I'm under the script that is written by another human being who is just as likely to fall prey to lust and greed as everything else, and have less of a chance of actually resisting it.
And that's one of the things that sort of piqued my theologian's interest as well, is because I think that what you just described is very close to how the Book of Wisdom and Paul describes the effect of idols. Is that we think that we're worshiping the gods, but in fact what we're doing is we're doing the bidding of the people who made the idols.
Yes, it says we're worshiping. Isaiah says that a lot too. It's like we're worshiping the work of our hands. That have, because we've made idols in the Old Testament model, right? They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear. Mouths but do not speak. And that, and that those who worship them become like them.
Exactly.
When we worship what we make, we become less human.
Yeah. So this is actually also something that McLuhan noticed in understanding media, but I mean he didn't put it this way, but I think you can draw the analogy with technology, and idolatry is a kind of technology actually. With technology, we shape our tools, and thereafter they shape us. With idolatry, we shape our idols, and thereafter they shape us.
Yeah. So we're going to take a break in a few minutes, and then after we come back, I really want to dive into this relationship between what we're seeing going on here and then what the fathers of the church taught about demons. But before we do that, would you just say a few minutes a little bit about your own story? How did you get interested in becoming maybe a Catholic, becoming a Catholic theologian? And then how did you get interested in the topic of working on, our contemporary digital age?
So I grew up in the Archdiocese of Seattle. Seattle is a very secular place. And I'm a cradle Catholic. My parents were very devout and raised me in that kind of environment. And so it was actually sort of a shock when I went to college and realized that other people, including other Catholics, didn't necessarily have even the same sort of moral opinions that I did. And to some degree, I think everybody has something like that, that realization. But for me, I grew up in the pro-life movement, and my parents were very active in Human Life of Washington. And so what was most shocking to me was that even many of my fellow Catholics, even many of the priest professors I had, were pro-abortion. And so I started having to think about, okay, what is it that actually does begin to develop our moral opinions, and how do we come up with our ideas of justice if people who had kind of similar upbringings in the church come to such radically different opinions about such a fundamental and important topic? And so I spent about 2 years after graduation trying to figure out whether I wanted to pursue that in philosophy or theology. I was a philosophy major as an undergrad. And I decided that theology really does concern ultimate reality in a more specific way than philosophy. So I thought that would be the way to go. And as you know, I mean, my dissertation was really on political philosophy and theology. And so the first area I was kind of investigating that is what effect does the political regime we live in have an effect on the development of our opinions, our theological opinions, our moral opinions, et cetera. And it's only recently, maybe in the past 8 years, that I've started thinking about the way in which the media environment also does the same thing.
Wow, that's really a wonderful story. And it is always, I think it's interesting to see how different people will encounter this kind of you either encounter kind of our pluralistic age, which ironically, of course, isn't very pluralistic, because once you enter the world of like the elite thinkers, they all tend to think the same,
yeah, that's right?
It's but and you either, I think, have that there's that you're confronted with something, and in a way you either it reminds me a little bit of the language in the Old Testament of like it's going to harden your heart when
yeah.
It's either going to harden if this is a moment when you're either going to turn to really wonder what are the deeper reasons for what's going on, and why do I think this, and why do other people think this, and how do this tradition that's been passed on, is it a deeper source of wisdom? Or that, but it's those very moments that kind of become the catalyst for maybe, the hardening the heart perhaps against the faith and theology, or the kind of strengthening of the heart to be willing in a certain sense to, just to kind of like continue to dive in and trust that the tradition has answers in a way that are contemporary thing. And it's very interesting too that, you talk a little bit about that with respect to the social situation and the political situation. The political situation, in part, going back a couple hundred years. One of the things I work on with the students that I'm trying to get them to see is we have the last roughly 2 to 3 decades of a huge shift in social technologies.
Yeah.
Right. Just massive. Right. Then we have the last 2 to 3 centuries of a massive shift in an understanding of modernity and politics and in the Enlightenment. And then you go back 2 to 3 millennia, right, for the whole understanding of what the Plato and Aristotle discovered, but also what Jesus what Jesus revealed and Paul preached.
Yeah.
Right. And then so we have these different layers, but I think it's interesting the way you're describing, that disincarnate self, which we see happening in aspects of at least the mass media. But at the same time, that's somewhat already present kind of in modernity, in Locke and in Kant and in others where, in Descartes, it's kind of like they become skeptical about our knowledge of the outside world. So the only thing that they really believe is the inner world, and how the inner world relates to the outer world they don't fully know.
Yeah, that's right. So so one of the, I think, bewildering things that's starting to happen now is that digital technology demassifies. And so I don't think there is a mass media anymore, or at least the mass media now has a competitor, a kind of decentralized digital media. And you can see that people are coming into contact with the fact of pluralism a lot earlier and with a lot more force. And so it'll be interesting and probably a little scary to see how that plays out.
It could be even an interesting way of seeing like the political polarization.
Yes.
Maybe, of course, we often see that as a negative thing, and maybe it is perhaps in part, but it's also the failure of a number of dominant governmental and societal and a handful of TV channels dominate all the news back in the 80s.
Right.
So TV
was really good at producing illusions of consensus.
Yeah, that's very well put. So we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to dive into a little bit of the demonology of the internet.
All right.
So thanks again for being on the show today. We'll see you in a minute.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
And as we mentioned before, Dr. Harmon has his master's and his PhD from Ave Maria, so we're delighted to have you back on the show, and a real kind of a living witness to, I want to say advertisement, but I think it's deeper, a witness to, an embodied witness, right, to the value of what can go on at a Catholic university, and that the education offered at places like Ave Maria can really bear fruit.
That's right, yeah, and that's one of the things that really attracted me in the first place to the program here, and is really how Father Lamb pitched it to me, is that we're doing something new here that's going to bear fruit, and it did take a little bit of faith in the beginning. I remember actually the groundbreaking here, and so whenever I come back, I just marvel at how much progress is being made. So it's really fun to see all the energy, all the students that are here, all of the buildings that have gone up. So it's really fun coming back intermittently and seeing visually that progress.
That is great. I know, and Father Matthew Lamb, and by the way, I should mention that I hold the Father Matthew Lamb Chair in Catholic Theology, so he was a great mentor to me, a friend, and it's great to be able to honor him. But he would always say that, the first millennium, in the first 1,000 years of the Church, we focused on theology in wisdom and holiness. It was really done in the monasteries. In the second millennium, theology switched to, in a way, the schools and universities. So we then had the development of science and scholarship. And these are all good things. But by the end of the second millennium, somehow the science and scholarship became divorced from wisdom and holiness. So we knew more and more about parts and less about the whole.
Yeah.
I don't remember who it was, but somebody in one of these books I've been reading recently said that, in modernity and in the contemporary society, we have more efficient means to less important ends,
That's right. Yes.
And so Father Lamb would always say, though, is that's our work for the third millennium, is to somehow we have to work to reunite wisdom and holiness, or basically reintegrate science and scholarship into wisdom and holiness.
Yeah.
And I think we see that in terms of that's just discovering meaning. And in part, one of the things you mentioned is that when you begin to discover that this is no longer working, you begin to become perhaps more open to solutions. And even
Yes.
I was looking at the CDC has some studies in 2022 and 2023, but they basically showed that from like 2011 to 2021, you have, basically in younger people, both teens and young adults, suicide rates are doubling. Depression rates are going up from like 30 to above 40. I think for young women, young girls, it's like 59% feel persistently hopeless and sad. 40% overall, and men are slightly less, only like 2 out of 5, but they have much higher rates of suicide.
Yep.
So it's kind of like we're not doing well.
No.
And I do think that recognizes that, and even the people I see that spend lots of, some people that will spend like 10 hours a day just scrolling on their phones. Nobody really thinks this is a great way to live.
Right.
And so I do think that's creating an openness. Now, one of the things in this work that you're working on, the demonology of the internet, maybe could you say a little bit more about what is how is it that the internet affects us? And not just the internet isn't just like it's also algorithms that have been written by human beings, often to sell things. I think it says the social dilemma says if you're not paying, you're the product.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And as it goes on a little bit farther, it's the subtle and imperceptible shift in your behavior and attitudes that companies are selling online.
That's right. Yeah. So McLuhan makes the point that magazine advertisements, when magazines started to be a big deal in the early to middle part of the 20th century, they shifted from just sort of advertising their products to creating a sense of community. And so the idea was that the product would be the basis of some kind of human community, actually. And so in a way, it's a precursor to our subscription model nowadays, so that you would buy the product, yes, because you like using the product, but also because it connects you with other people who use the product. Okay, so that's that aspect of advertising, I think, also gets enhanced with social media.
And we end up then in a way that now community is somewhat centered around our commercial and consumptive activities. You do this aspect of what they call like consumer capitalism. We become what we buy, and we become identified with one another. There's they're talking about kind of, and I guess that does start in some ways with whether or not it's Better Homes and Gardens, Ms. Magazine, some of these, but even, you think about even like, Playboy magazine, these different magazines in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that began to kind of like dominate certain kinds of externalized forms of connection that were not kind of organic in a way, or are often not really embodied.
Right. Now, I think there's actually some hope now because one of the effects of internet or digital technology is fragmentation. And so a lot of these like fake communities become clear as fake. And there's a dissatisfaction that results, and I think a real yearning and search for something more real. I think there was a kind of like fake detour that began about 20 years ago with reality television. So the idea that, okay, we recognize that people want a more authentic experience, so we're going to create this new kind of fake thing that seems more authentic, right? But actually, I think people just really do want something more real. And actually, I think that's another reason why Father Lamb's schema of wisdom and holiness and then science and scholarship might give us some hope as well, because I think that the internet is going to begin reviving, and already is reviving, certain medieval modes of discourse. And I'm not an expert on this. There's a guy named Mark Stallman who writes on this at the Center for the Study of Digital Life, and he's very interesting on these topics. But basically, like I do think that a lot of medieval genres are starting to get revived. So YouTube comments sort of function like medieval glosses, and even sort of like a lot of internet art is sort of like illumination, and also I think that we're sort of in the period of the early Middle Ages when, because our fake illusion of consensus has been shattered, we're now looking to collect authorities. which is how originally scholasticism begins, is with settling on authorities and then beginning a dialectic among them. We haven't reached the dialectic part yet, but if you notice, there are kind of amalgamations of viewers attached to certain authorities on the internet. So you get, Neil deGrasse Tyson on the one hand, maybe Jordan Peterson on the other, Bishop Barron, and they become, or they are becoming sort of authorities. And you see also that they're beginning to, in a way, develop sort of schools patterned after their thought. So I think we're repeating certain aspects of the early Middle Ages right now. Hopefully we can get into the more advanced state in time. But I do think there's a prospect there because many things are now available, are now discoverable that weren't through the internet, that we may be able to revive certain ways of living and being that undeservedly were neglected or forgotten or deliberately cast aside. Yeah. I think that Leo Strauss makes a comment that it's not so much that the early modern philosophers refuted antiquity as sort of pulled a fast one. And I actually think that one nice thing about the digital age is that we might end up being able to see that the way of life generated by antiquity was abandoned not for any good reason. So we'll see. I mean, it's not necessary that that happens, but it's a possibility.
Now, of course, so you are, and I think this is really true, is that certain access to communities, access to communicators and to modes of communication has been and is accelerated through the internet and even social media and these sorts of different things. And yet at the same time, we're not neutral as human beings.
Nope.
And in some ways, I think the tools we use are not neutral because they're designed by other human beings. And we have...
And they actually have internal biases built into them as well. So
yeah, right. And we have a bent, a twist in our nature. So in order for us to achieve some of these good things that you're identifying, we have to first maybe become aware of and recognize this, this twisted, bent character. And so let's talk a little bit about that. I think Augustine talks a little bit about it, right? That we have maybe this vice of curiositas or curiosity. We have certain kind of disordered desires. We have, of course, an overweening sense of ego and lust and greed and all of these different understandings. I throw fear in there and all sorts of different things. So how did Augustine think? Because Augustine doesn't think that the demons have immediate power over us, right? The demons can't move us around. They can't change our thoughts, right? How did Augustine think that the fallen angels could somewhat how did they prey upon our vulnerabilities?
Yeah. Actually, the demons wouldn't want to do those things to us because it might terrify us, but that's where it would stop. What they really want is to involve us freely in their evil. And so they set traps for us. Okay. The problem with us is that our freedom is, but the problem and the glory of us is that our freedom is a creaturely freedom. So it's got limits to it. And those limits have their conditions in a wide variety of things, of factors in our history and our individual makeup and families that we grew up in and political regime we grew up in, et cetera. And we don't often pay attention to those things, let alone our kind of vices. Okay, so there's a lot that's going on with the various factors that go into our motivations for acting, most of which we're not aware of, usually, unless you're a really, really self-possessed and probably holy person. And so because we lack awareness of those things, we just think we're going along, doing our thing, acting, in the best way we think we should. When, as a matter of fact, we are motivated by all sorts of things that we're not paying attention to at any given moment. And what Augustine notices is that especially on Christian teaching, he says that he notices some weird factors about divination, which is the attempt to get the demons to tell us things about either the future or the past or things that are happening a long way from us. And he says that, what usually happens is that by, say, observing the flight of a bird, it's not that you're noticing, it's not that the sign has something to say in itself that it then tells to you. It's that there's something in you that predisposes you to look for something in particular. So I think it's sort of analogous to what we call confirmation bias nowadays. And so you look at the sign that's apparently supernatural, and in fact what's happening is that you're reading into it through motivated reasoning something that you already kind of want. And that's usually on the basis of some vice or sin that you have. And that's where the demons can manipulate you. They can present things that they know will trap you. Because they know the kind of baits that will work on you given your particular makeup, and because they're so smart, and because they've got much longer lives than we are, and because they're so observant, they actually in most cases know us better than we know ourselves as far as what motivates us to act, and so they can present these things that manipulate us without us even noticing it.
So it's like all of a sudden you remember. You see somebody, and then you remember a time that your first thing that comes to your mind is a memory of maybe a time they slighted you years ago.
Yeah.
And you just become annoyed with them. Well, it's like, whoa, wait a second. I have the strong disposition to resentment. And it's kind of like, well, what can the demon can do? Nothing, except they can maybe suggest an image to our imagination. Or somebody who's trying to, I don't know, live greater purity. You can have a suggestion of your imagination. Somebody who's trying to, I don't know, be less afraid, and then all of a sudden you get a suggestion. So it's like the demons can't do anything new, but they can kind of prey upon our vulnerabilities. They can suggest things to us that are kind of aligned with our worst selves.
Yeah, they can arrange things in ways that draw something out of us by our will that's already there and that they know, but maybe we don't. That's precisely right. Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting as well. You mentioned in a talk you gave recently on this topic that 2 Corinthians 11, I think it's 14, says that even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And so this is one of the problems, right, is that the demons can disguise themselves as angels of light. What do you think that means about actually the demonic, but also what does it mean about the internet?
So to me, this is the scariest verse in the entire Bible, okay? Because it shows in a way how on our own we're completely vulnerable to manipulation by the devil. So this is a terrifying passage for me, okay? So I think that a lot of the ways that the devil can tempt us that Augustine describes are the same means that we're manipulated through the internet. And so, like, I don't wear one anymore, but I used to wear a Fitbit, for instance. The Fitbit gives, Fitbit, the company, all sorts of biometric data on me. I don't know what they're going to use it for, but that's not very different from the demon being a very precise observer of how I act. So there may be something in my sleep patterns or my heart rate or something that a demon can use to manipulate me. Just like if Fitbit knows what my state of health is, they could probably target advertising toward me. That would be very effective, okay? Yeah. So we give the internet voluntarily through wearing devices, through clicks and interactions, etc., through all of our behaviors on the internet, we give those various companies which utilize powerful algorithms a huge amount of data on our behavior. And so the profiles that these companies or governments have on us are kind of like the knowledge of the demons, in that probably they know to a more precise and deeper degree what makes us motivated to act than we do, at least on a moment-to-moment basis. And so they can use that data in the same way that the demons can use that data. So now, whenever you act badly because you've been manipulated through an algorithm, does that mean there's a demon at the other end pulling the lever? Not necessarily. but also we shouldn't dismiss the possibility as well. So,
yeah. And definitely the fact that that the algorithms are set up to find out what motivates us, like without even thinking about it. What are the things I click on without even thinking about it? Because in some ways, right, the companies have designed a lot of the and they made it clear to kind of like be addictive. You want to stay on. There's a little bit of roulette going on. It's kind of the intermittent reinforcement, gives you more dopamine. Boring, interesting. Boring.
Yeah.
Well, maybe, and then all of a sudden, the more distracted you are, the more likely you are to stay on, and then the more likely you are to be susceptible to advertising. So they're kind of basically our attention is for sale, and in a lot of ways, we're just not as free as we think we are. We think we are masters of our attention, but in a lot of ways, developing attention is a real gift. So we are beginning to kind of work a little bit towards the end of our time. But I did want to maybe ask you, because I know, and again, in this talk you gave, you not only spoke about the demonology of the internet and the way in which, right, these things, and again, other people that are seeking to manipulate and sell our behavior, right? And that's, of course, just part of the world. You go to a marketplace, right? I don't know, in Africa, people are yelling out trying to sell stuff into you, but you need to be aware it's happening.
Yeah.
But you also spoke a little bit about kind of ultimately maybe the Eucharist and the sacraments as perhaps when we are in this situation, right? Yeah, if I had to contend with Satan alone, I would be afraid. But I don't have to, because not only has Christ entered into the world and conquered Satan, Christ has left me the church with the Bible, the sacraments, and the creeds, right? And so I'm not trying to figure out what to believe or what to do based upon, birds or clouds, but based upon, right, the concrete embodied life of Jesus Christ, his resurrected being as communicated to me, right, through the scriptures, the sacraments, and, right, the creed, the living tradition of the church. So how is it that the kind of sacraments, and maybe the Eucharist in particular, become the kind of antidote? They become really what is, I don't know, what is ultimately going to either, keep us sane or not.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not immediately clear how the leap happens, but there's a pretty simple to follow chain of reasoning that gets us to the sacraments, actually. So I haven't decided whether Demonology of the Internet is going to be the main title or the subtitle, but the other part of it is going to be the Spirits of the Air. And the Spirits of the Air is a traditional title. It's from Ephesians, and it gets used a lot in the spiritual tradition. And the idea is the reasons why the demons are the spirits of the air is because they, in a way, kind of block our progress from the earth to heaven. Okay, and so they kind of try to become false mediators between us and the divine by substituting themselves for God. Okay, that is a little bit how we can understand media manipulations nowadays as well. But so McLuhan says that what happens with the incarnation is that Christ creates an entirely new perceptual environment through his body, and I think a really nice way of understanding that is with St. Athanasius. So for St. Athanasius, what Christ does is he kind of makes a surprise attack on the flesh. And he surprisingly to the devil takes on flesh. And as a strong wrestler, Athanasius says, he challenges the devil on his own turf in a way and beats him. So he sort of pins the spirit of the air to the earth through the incarnation. And that actually leads into a really important insight by St. Thomas Aquinas, which is that there are particular reasons why the sacraments, which are, of course, the extension of Christ's humanity in history, why the sacraments are bodily. And that's because one of the effects of sin is it fixes our attention on matter. It lowers our attention from the higher things to the lowest things. And so it's important that Christ appears in the flesh and that the sacraments are bodily. And so the sacraments then provide a kind of training or exercise in fixing our attention on material things that nevertheless signify divine mysteries, okay, and then can help raise our gaze once more to the divine mysteries. And so the sacraments provide a way of fixing this problem that sin introduces. And so it's that practice, that kind of steady practice of regular reception of the sacraments and also participation in the communities that the Eucharist developed, which we call the church, which are embodied communities, right? That provides a sort of antidote to the pride of the spirits of the air. And I think that this ancient ascetical practice, custody of the eyes, becomes very important now. Is that, well, how do you train your attention? Well, you have to actually take control of your gaze. And fortunately for us, Christ has entered into the ambit of our gaze. And so his bodily presence in the sacraments, in the art and the music that his bodily presence enables and empowers, can help train our senses so that our internal life can be directed back to God.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing connection. It's really beautiful. I know that I think Aquinas and Augustine also talk about that idea that because we become idolatrous of material things, God becomes matter so that he can lead us back home. And I also think there's a little bit there that, even back in our tradition, in St. Teresa of Avila, her great work, Interior Castle, she talks about how that, right, she never leaves behind the sacred humanity of Jesus Christ in her prayer. If you want to pray, don't just pray about spiritual things.
Right.
Always return to the sacred humanity of Jesus Christ. That's where I see God's love for me. I may not always feel God's love, but I will see, right, God's love for me in the, incarnate nature of Jesus Christ. And I think it's interesting as well because then you can take that idea and then move to the idea that what we want to do is use technological means to enter back into embodied relationships with one another and with so that, again, the technological means are not evil, but on their own, because we are slightly bent and the other people with whom we're interacting are slightly bent, we will, if we are not wise, we will become weaker and less efficacious versions of ourselves. Right. But if we pull that back and then use the technological means to create more substantive communities and enter back into one another, does seem the way forward. So there's real quickly, just 3 quick questions, and we're running a little bit late, so if you can just give relatively short answers. What's the book you've been reading?
A book I've been reading? Well, I just finished Lord of the World for the first time.
Wow.
So I'm teaching that. So that actually has a lot of relevance for the things that we're talking about.
Robert Hugh Benson's work, 1907, and it's about the the
coming of the Antichrist.
The coming of the Antichrist. It's very, very interesting. Pope Francis recommended it really importantly in 2015 or something.
That's right. Actually, and Pope Benedict called it one of his favorite books too.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. What's a practice you do on a regular basis to find meaning and draw closer to God?
I hug my kids as much as possible. So.
That's beautiful. I love it. That's incarnate.
That's right. Yeah.
And then what's a belief you held about God that you discovered was false, and what was the truth you discovered?
Oh boy, that's a good one. Pretty early on, actually. I mean, it's funny considering how much we've been talking about the sacraments. When I was in 7th grade, I went to our parish school, and at one point I asked my mother, "We don't actually really believe that Jesus is in the Eucharist, right?" So that was actually one of my first theological questions, is because I thought it was unbelievable. And so my parents actually had to explain that to me. So that was a big deal for me, and I still remember that as a kind of watershed moment where that was the first time I had to think theologically.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful. And when you really have to make an act of faith, which is an act of trust in what is more than I can understand.
Yeah, and what did my mom and dad do? They sent me to the catechism, actually. So it was trust specifically in the teaching of the church. So.
Well, that's beautiful. Well, again, Professor Thomas Harmon, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a delight to have you back. You've at Ave Maria 12 years ago. You graduated with your PhD from here, but you've just done amazing work in terms of as a teacher, as writing online, and I think you have a new book on Augustine and
that's right, yeah.
The universal sacrifice of.
So it'll be called The Universal Way of Salvation, and the thought of Augustine, T&T Clark Bloomsbury in May.
Yeah, very much a wonderful scholarly book. So again, thanks so much for being on the show, and we're grateful. And thank you for listening today to the Catholic Theology Show. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.